Welcome to another amazing episode of Getting Open with me, your host, Andrea Miller. Whew. I love the show. I talk with Alex Howard, and we get into how you can heal from so many of those past wounds and genuinely transform your life and your relationship. So if you're mad and feel resentment toward your parents, the show is for you. If you or someone you love is dealing with chronic conditions, chronic health conditions, the show is for you. If you or someone you love is dealing with crippling anxiety or addiction or many other conditions, this show is for you. Bring your questions because we've got answers. Let's get into it. I am so excited to introduce Alex Howard. Alex is the founder and chairman of the Optimum Health Clinic, one of the world's leading integrative medicine clinics with a team of 25 full-time practitioners supporting thousands of patients in over 50 countries. Alex is also the creator of the therapeutic coaching methodology, and since 2020 has been documenting his therapeutic work with real patients via his incredible YouTube series called In Therapy with Alex Howard. Alex has also created some of the largest online conferences in the health and mind-body markets, which have been attended by over 1 million people. Finally, he is also the author of 3 books, including his latest, It's Not Your Fault, Why Childhood Trauma Shapes You and How to Break Free, which I love. So thanks for writing that. It has been so helpful to me. And welcome, Alex. It's so great to have you on Getting Open.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah. Okay, so you have such a compelling and beautiful life story, and you've used it to treat literally millions of people. I'd love for you to set the stage and talk about your personal background, the abandonment by your dad, the early stresses, your debilitating health issues. And critically, I want to add for our listeners, when I think about people having intractable health issues, anxiety, trauma, Alex, your story is such a powerful example. I mean, it gives me chills even saying the words of how you can free yourself and live a healthy, beautiful life if you're willing to do the work. And so take the time to just set this all up, and then I've got a million more questions for you.
Sure. Yeah, well, I like a lot of people that end up doing this work. I was catalyzed into this work because of my own struggles, as you mentioned. I suffered from a debilitating chronic illness from my mid-teens to my early 20s, which was a kind of fatigue-based condition. And so my primary symptom was fatigue, but also symptoms of muscle pains and dizziness and sleep disturbance and so on. And the first couple of years of that was really waiting for somebody else to find the answers. And I went and saw various different mainstream practitioners, naturopaths and healers and all kinds of things, and reached a point a couple of years in where my physical symptoms hadn't really changed, but I was starting to become pretty desperate. And I'm always very defensive when people suggest the idea that complex chronic illnesses are simply caused by what's happening psychologically and emotionally. I think there's a big part that can play, but it's not the only part. I think what people often forget is when you suffer from a medically unexplained illness and you don't know what's wrong, why it's wrong, are you ever going to get better, will it ever change? There is a big psychological impact of living with that level of uncertainty and that level of suffering. And so I reached a point of I wasn't actively planning how I was going to end my life, but I'd certainly reached the point that I'd lost any real sense of hope for my future at this point. And I had a conversation which was kind of one of those moments where you realize in hindsight, your whole life changes in one conversation. And it was with my uncle. He basically asked me a series of questions. And
hang on, I just have to ask, was this your mom's brother or your dad's brother?
My mom's brother.
Okay, I assume, because I want to talk about your dad too, but okay.
Sure.
All right, so keep going.
Sure. Yeah, and so the questions were, firstly, on a scale of 0 to 10, how badly do you want this situation to change? And I I don't know why this is what I came up with, but I decided that I wasn't going to murder someone and I wasn't going to chop off one of my limbs. But apparently anything else was on the cards. And so I decided I was a 9.5 out of 10. Like I would do pretty much anything to change the situation. And then he asked me to come up with a list of things that I thought could potentially change the situation that I was in. So I had things on that list like learning meditation, yoga, learning more about nutrition, learning more about the role of psychology. He then asked me how many hours a day I was spending doing those things that I believed could make a difference. Right? And the answer was pretty much none. Right? I had this list of things, but I wasn't doing them. He then asked me, okay, well, how many hours a day do you spend watching television? Now, this was the mid-90s. This was like 1998 when I had this conversation. So we're not talking this golden age we live in now of like all this amazing good television. We're talking about like
we're
bad
talking
British,
Family Feud and Love Boat.
not even that. We're talking like bad British soap operas, basically.
Oh, okay, even worse.
And so the answer was I was watching 7 hours a day of television. No, not because I was enjoying it, because I was basically numbing myself out to the reality that I was in. And there may be people that are watching this now and their thing is that they're on social media or they're playing video games. But the point was I was spending 7 hours a day basically numbing myself. And his point was, okay, well, you're a 9.5 out of 10. You got a list of things that you could be doing, and you're spending 7 hours a day watching television. Like, I don't understand. Help me understand. And what I really came to realize was if I wanted the circumstances of my life to be different, then I was going to have to be the one to change them. And of course, I had all kinds of reasons why that wasn't possible. I was 18 years old. I didn't have financial resources. I didn't even like science at school. Like it wasn't like I was some science geek that was going to go and read all the research. But over the next 5 years, I went on a very sincere, very committed, and very intense healing journey. And in that time, I read hundreds of books. I made this commitment. I'd never watch more than 2 hours television a day, which I didn't for the next 5 years. I meditated every day for increasingly long periods of time. I practiced yoga pretty much every day. I got deeply into psychology and self-development and so on. And what I often say is that I went into that journey thinking I was going to find the answer. And I didn't find the answer. What I found were many answers. And then when I fully recovered, that really became the foundation of the Optimum Health Clinic, which is that when it comes to complex chronic illnesses, we also do a lot of work these days with trauma, with anxiety, depression, and so on. My perspective is these are all complex conditions that don't have single answers. We have to build frameworks and maps to understand them, and then everyone's journey through that can be different. But the kind of initiation of my path to do this work was I wanted to build the organization that I had wanted to exist in those years that I had been ill. So there's a kind of second part to the story. You were asking about my kind of trauma healing journey. We'll maybe come to in a minute, but just, yeah, that was the beginning, let's say, of the journey.
That is amazing. It just fills my heart with so much joy. I was telling you right before we started that one of my sons has I want to make sure I said it right, say it right, complex chronic illness. And it's tough, man. I mean, we're here in America, you're in Great Britain, and it just feels like no matter where you are, these kinds of conditions can be really, really intractable. Let me ask you this, just for people who are listening who have a complex chronic condition, what is the best way to determine whether, and you said over 50, or not, you didn't say, I said it, but you help people in over 50 countries. Critically, for people that are like, yes, this could be my answer, what is the best way for them to determine whether your clinic can help them? How do they reach either, probably not you, but somebody in your organization that can do an assessment?
Well, the first thing I would say is that where we come in is where mainstream approaches are stuck, right? So if someone has debilitating fatigue, they shouldn't contact us first. They should go and see their physician. They should go and see their general medical practitioner and have all the appropriate investigations. Where we typically come in, if someone's done that, They've either been told there's nothing wrong with you, where they know there clearly is something wrong with them, or they've been told there's something wrong and there's nothing we can do about it. So where we come in is we have a different lens, a different framework, a different way of working. And we are not just looking at it from a kind of more mainstream medical germ theory perspective, like looking for the single pathogen that's the cause for the single treatment that's the answer. We're looking at a much more multi-systems level. We're looking at it from a mind-body level. We're looking at it from a functional level. Like sometimes someone can have imbalances that are within reference range in mainstream medicine, but they're actually not the optimum ranges for that individual. And then in answer to your question, in that instance, someone will contact us. Our website is just theoptimumhealthclinic.com. And we have a very robust intake process. And so anyone that wants to go out with us, they have what's called a discovery call with one of the clinical team. And then we will basically map whether we think we can help or not. And we are surprisingly direct in how we answer that question.
Oh, hallelujah, brother.
It's not in our interest to take people on we don't think we can help.
Totally. And that says so much about your ethos and your team. That's awesome. Okay. So rewind. So that was the first part of your story. And now let's talk about the second bit that I think I have a sense, having read your book, but you tell the story, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, if my life was a Hollywood movie, that would have been the end of the story.
Right, exactly. You go off in the sunset, happily ever after.
But so I started the Optimum Health Clinic when I was, I qualified as a practitioner when I was 22. And I spent a year, 18 months working with one of my teachers. And then I started the clinic when I was 24 in 2004. And the clinic became very successful very quickly. I think for a few different reasons, partly because people resonated with my story, but also partly because we were doing things at that time that really no one else was doing in the way that we were doing. So we were a long way ahead of the curve. And what we did was working for a lot of people. And so a few years into that, I found myself sort of back on my own healing journey. And not really a physical healing journey, but more of my own trauma healing journey. That I realized that I had come out of my my ME or chronic fatigue healing journey, having done a lot of good things, but I hadn't really addressed my own childhood traumas. And so I found myself with having a period of my life with very severe anxiety, panic attacks, a number of kind of unhealthy relationships. I just couldn't seem to last in a relationship longer than 3 months was basically the problem. And so I went back to really approaching my trauma healing in the same way that I'd approached my physical healing, which was I was very deeply committed. I was very focused on, and I had the reference point of, well, when I went hard at my physical healing, it transformed. I want to do the same here for my emotional healing. And I realized a couple of things. I realized that we all have been shaped and impacted by childhood experiences. And so I'm not standing here telling my story thinking that I'm particularly unique in this. I think we've all been impacted. But the things that had impacted me particularly were firstly having a father who left soon after I was born. So I was a failed attempt to save the marriage, basically. And we didn't see my father then. I later part of the story is I ended up meeting him in my early 30s. But I grew up without having a father that was present. And then the pressures of that on my mom, who was then working 3 jobs and under huge kind of financial pressure, and because my father also wasn't providing financial support. And then my sister had, and still has, very severe mental health issues. And so growing up in a very volatile environment, she was hospitalized on some occasions and she was put in foster care, but sort of in and out of those things. But a lot of sort of physical destruction, psychological kind of complexity and things that were going on. And so what I came to realize was that I had learned certain defensive strategies which were now causing a lot of suffering in my life. And one of the ways I talk about it is the walls that we build to protect ourselves in childhood often become the walls of the prison that trap us in our adult life. And so for me, what that had been was it hadn't felt safe to really feel my feelings into my emotions. So basically my whole nervous system had sped up as a protective strategy, and I'd got very much into my mind. The problem was that then as I'd had this career that had become quite successful and there was more and more pressure, my system couldn't handle the pressure because I was already had all of this internal pressure. And then I was defining my value and my self-worth by my achievements. And when I felt like I couldn't sustain this in that way, my sort of sense of self was disintegrating. And then when it came to relationships, one way to think about a relationship is intimacy is in to me see. And when we're in a really kind of difficult place inside of ourselves, it's very hard to be intimate and to be open with another person. So the short version of a long story was I realized that I needed to work with my trauma. I needed to process and metabolize what was held in my body. I needed to work to regulate my nervous system in a different way. I needed to unhook my self-esteem from my external achievements and accomplishments. And that was its own journey that took its own period of time. But on the other side of that, the anxiety and panic attacks stopped. I went from not being able to have a relationship longer than 3 months to then meeting my now wife, and we've been together now, I think it's 14, 15 years. And so really my whole life transformed as a result. And one of the ways I like to put it is the things we most want to avoid in our inner work are typically the places where the greatest treasures lie, right? So going for a period where I felt I had no choice but to go to those places was, for me, really was the blessing and was the place where the real healing happened.
Yeah, there's a great Freud quote. I think it says, I'm going to butcher it, but it's like, where there's fear is where you must go, or something like that. And I'm totally butchering it, but I'm with you with that idea where that place of resistance. So what was that for you? I mean, the thing that you were just desperate to avoid, what was that?
For me, that was feeding my emotions. In fact, I remember being on a retreat. I think it's where the first chapter actually of my last book. I was on this retreat where I sort of realized that it's kind of like the proverbial rock in the hard place, right? It's like, do I continue doing what I'm doing, which is constantly being avoidant and my avoidance strategy was anxiety, right? Like constantly being in my head. So I don't want to continue there, but the alternative is to go to the place that I also deeply fear, which is to feel all of these feelings and emotions. And for me, a lot of that initially was the hatred and rage towards my father who had abandoned me. So then feeling my sense of fear and anxiety about the instability of the situation that I'd grown up in. And really the sense that they didn't feel, at least initially, that there was a safe place inside of me. And so I kind of needed to constantly be away from that. And so a big part of that healing was to really lean into those feelings and lean into that pain, because it's through that we actually find what we're missing.
Yeah, there's no way around but through. And oh my God, it was painful to listen to you describe lying on the floor with your therapist, I forget his name, and just what you described in the utter hatred and rage and collapse into profound sadness. You described just crying uncontrollably. I mean, I could feel your emotion as you described that. And then, oh my God, it just gives me chills. That carried on probably interminably for you. And then you described this like incredible sense of love and warmth that overtook you. And it was like, amen to once that resistance, it feels like this great metaphor of once we surrender, what's on the other side is like, yes, can we just go there? And you just articulated so beautifully. And I just also want to add for the listeners, first of all, please read this book. It's so beautiful and so filled. We're not going to be able to get to even a fraction of what I want to get to because we don't have time in an hour. There are so many beautiful takeaways and helpful takeaways. You also talk so openly about listen, to do what you did at 22 years old is incredible. and the professional success you were having, you were really open about having crippling panic attacks and a crippling anxiety when you were going to speak as a leader in your industry. I mean, it's just this really interesting dichotomy, to say the least. And I throw this out there because so many people would go, "Oh crap, like that is, how does that even make sense?" And yet I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not explaining this right.
I understand your question. Yeah.
That you were at the pinnacle of your career, you'd had all this success, and yet you yourself were still hurting so much. And I just, that to me is such an important part of your story, that you were willing to talk about that, because everybody looking at you would go, "Wow, this guy's got it totally together," and yet you were crippled inside. And that, I just appreciate your talking about that so openly, because I think a lot of people would relate to what's on the outside and the pretense of what they're supposed to be, and how, what others expect of them. And then when there is when it's inconsonant between how they're feeling and how they think they're supposed to be. And that, and you realize, like, you had to do that work. Like you said, you were between a rock and a hard place. I appreciate your, keeping it real.
Yeah, well, a couple of things about that. I mean, firstly, one way to think about it is from a perspective of different lines of development, right? We can be very developed in certain ways, but it doesn't mean that all aspects of ourselves are fully developed, right? And so one can be to have an important message and have realization and integration of certain things, but it doesn't mean that all aspects of themselves are grounded in that way. And I think what happened to me was that my external success at that time was ahead of my internal ability to hold that. And I think one of the things which was a real blessing, it has been a real blessing doing the clinical work that I do, is I'm particularly doing it at such a young age, was, particularly in my 20s, I'd have people come into my clinic room who on the outside looked like they had it all, right? Like they had, financial, and maybe they had things at that time in my life I didn't have what I wanted, right? Like maybe they had financial success, or maybe they had, kind of long-term relationship, like whatever it may be. But then, of course, they would come and tell me all the things in their life that weren't working. And so in a way, it was a deep blessing for me, because I came to realize that how things look on the outside actually tells you very little about what's happening on the inside.
100%.
In fact, sometimes,
yes.
Yeah. And sometimes the more polished they are on the outside, the more of a clue there is that there's actually something that's being hidden that isn't like that on the inside.
Oh my God, 100%. I mean, isn't that the story of so many of our lives that we want to hide, right? I mean, it's certainly the story of my life. I'm an overachiever, and we'll get into some of my pathologies in a few minutes, because I got to keep it real with you. And honestly, actually, I listened to your book, so like listen. When you're talking about like all these maladaptive coping strategies, I'm like, check. Like, okay, now you really validated my experience. But let me go back to something that I feel like can be really controversial. The title of your book is "It's Not Your Fault." And you literally say early on, "and it's not your parents' fault." How much pushback do you get? And by the way, I totally agree, but I think a lot of people go, "Whoa, dude, F that. No, it's totally my parents' fault and they suck and blah, blah, blah." But talk about that, because I think if for people to come to that point of view that you have, that in itself, to me, is a transformative realization.
Yeah. So I talk about it is effective, and I can't remember if I framed it this way in the book, actually. I think I sort of clarified this bit afterwards. But in my mind, there are two things which are both true that are also contradict each other, right? So truth number one, for the younger, wounded part of us, it is our parents' fault. We didn't get what we needed, right? We all have core emotional needs, right? Like the need to feel safe, the need to feel loved for who we are as we are. And when those needs are not met, we don't develop emotionally and psychologically to our optimum. It's just like having a child that grows up with being malnourished for food, for example, being starved with oxygen. Like, they'll develop, but just not to their optimum. So part of one's healing work is to really let oneself own the hurts, the rage, the hatred, the anger, like the parts of them and the places in them that didn't get what they need to be validated in that experience. So that's truth number one. But truth number two is, if you then live in that place, you are now effectively a victim and you have no power. And one of the things that I've seen, which I think is a really big problem that has happened with certain psychotherapeutic approaches, for example, is this victim narrative that people come to understand their trauma, and they understand the context and the history of their trauma. And then it's like, and now I can't be the person I want to be, or I can't live the life I want to live because this stuff happened to me. And I think that is effectively certain psychotherapeutic approaches leaving people worse off than they started. Now, the second truth, and this is not necessarily true for everyone. I recognize there are instances which lay outside of this, but it is the truth for the vast majority of people. The second truth is that our parents loved us and they did the best that they could. And, I think about, my childhood, for example, and there's a lot of things I didn't get from my mum, and I had spent quite a lot of time in therapy unpacking and figuring all that stuff out. And my mum would have thrown herself in front of any bus on any day to protect and save me. And she still would now, much to my annoyance on certain occasions. but it's like, her love for her children is total and at times toxic and problematic. But the point is that my mum loved me, but I still didn't get what I needed. And one of the examples that I think I used in the book was, and I should say that the patient stories I use in the books are either completely true because they're people I've done filmed therapy sessions with, and they're on there. I have all those permissions, or they're sometimes composites of 2 or 3 different stories that have come together, and then it's kind of protect that person's the history. So this one is a composite of actually about 2 or 3 different people, but all basically had the same experience, which was being sent away to boarding school at a young age. And actually this element was one particular person where the parents really loved the child. In fact, they went under significant financial stress to pay the school fees to send this child away to boarding school because they believed it was the most loving, best thing that they could do for that child. And the child experienced, and this bit I've heard from about 2 or 3 different people, such severe pain and suffering that they thought they weren't even going to survive the experience. And then way it typically worked in those days in this country was that there were obviously no mobile phones. You weren't allowed to phone home, and you weren't allowed to write home for the first few weeks because they need to get a clean, basically severance of the parent-child bond. And you would then be allowed to write a letter after the first couple of weeks. So he writes the letter, and then the housemaster comes and says, yeah, we can't send the letter because it'll be too distressing for your parents to read.
Oh my God. So this is probably a letter. So the kid's probably saying, get me out of here. Yeah, I want to go home. Somebody save me. Mom, dad. Okay. But then they wouldn't allow that because, did you say it was too stressful for the parents?
Too stressful for the parents, or a more cynical perspective might be that they would lose a set of school fees to the school. That's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's not avoid the cynicism a little bit here. So in that moment, when they realize they're not going to be rescued, you've got one or two choices. Do you keep feeling this devastating sense of pain and abandonment, or do you shut it down and survive? They shut it down and survive, start getting good grades, start performing on the sports field, go home at Christmas, and parents are like, oh my God, it's been the making of you, you're doing great, right? So in that instance, this is not parents that don't love their child. This is parents that are willing to have great sacrifice for the love of their child. So the second truth is, from our adult perspective, we have to learn to understand the context within which our parents operated. Right? Now, the problem is if we over-index on one of these truths, we have problems. If we over-index on the feeling, the pain, and the suffering, and that becomes our story, we're now a victim. But if we over-index
and a prisoner, I feel like you can't have emotional freedom if you're always pointing the finger outward, like by definition, if you're a victim, well, then you don't have any agency. So that keeps you trapped.
It does. But then the other side of the equation is one rationalizes and forgives, just kind of what I'd done. They rationalize and forgive in their mind, but all the feelings and all the trauma is still locked in the body. So you still have all those defensive layers that are acting out. And so we actually need to be able to hold both places. We need to be able to hold the wounded younger child that needs to be allowed to have those feelings, but we need to not let that become our identity and not let that become our story, right? And so for me, the title of the book has to fit on the cover. So It's Not Your Fault is the title, but there is a second part to that, which is, but it is your responsibility to do your healing work.
Amen. I mean, we could stop the podcast. We won't. It is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. We need that meme. And totally. And just back to what I was saying a little while ago, your story is such a brilliant example of what's possible. And I want to give a big shout out to your uncle, right? And it just, I was sort of like smiling and nodding my head when he's asking you those key questions. And that's the truth for so many of us. We're stressed, we're unhappy. And yet if we were being honest with ourselves, if we had your wise uncle asking, well, how much time are you actually putting into your healing? I mean, so many of us would just be like, yeah, nah, right? Like little to nothing. And, we're taking our vitamins maybe and getting a little exercise. And these are all beneficial, but it's like there is that next level, like you say, the sincere commitment. And honestly, our stories are very different, but I've had a similar outcome. I always say I crossed the river, and yes, I continue to do my work, but holy smokes, it's worth it. Like, come on, come join us. That's what I say.
One of the things that was a real blessing for me from those years of my sort of late teens and early 20s was I realized that where we put our focus and energy consistently in our life is typically the things that grow and the things that move forwards, and I am still, whatever it is that conversation was 26 something years ago now, I still remember that feeling on the other side of the conversation, which was like, holy cow, like, can I actually do this? And there was no, and it wasn't like a sense of like, I know I can do it. It was like, can I do this? But there's something about, and there's lots of people, I think Joseph Campbell probably wrote about it originally, but the idea of the hero's journey, but there is something about being the hero in our own life. Right. I was saying to my wife recently, we've got 3 daughters between 7 and 13, and our middle daughter was under loads and loads of pressure for the school assessment. It was this whole situation, and I ended up being that ferocious parent going into the school and saying, this is not okay. But the point that isn't the point of the story. The point of the story is that I was saying to my wife after she completed this assessment, I was like, actually it was the night before she took the assessment. It's like, I really love the fact that not only do I love my children, but I respect my children, right? Like there's, and I think particularly for that father energy, and if it's a same-sex relationship, there's mother-father energy doesn't have to come from necessarily mother and father. But that energy, the kind of mother energy is, I love you and I adore you as you are. And the father energy is, go climb the tree, and if you fall down, climb higher, right? It's that sense of going out and taking on challenge. And the way that my daughter rose to that challenge, even though at times it was difficult, it's like I really respected the growth in her spirit as she was doing that. And I think one of the other struggles that I think is happening at the moment is there's an over-index on a lot of teaching around both this piece we spoke to around the sort of victim story, but there's also a lot of over-index, I think, on a sort of teaching around like an entitlement of, you just deserve everything that happens, think positive thoughts, it's all going to happen for you. And I don't think we speak enough about the gritty, hard work that it actually takes to really change. And because we don't speak about it enough, I think a lot of people end up dissatisfied and frustrated because they can't work out why things aren't changing.
Right. No, in fact, I was going to ask you that. It's a perfect segue. that there are so many people. I mean, listen, in America, our Surgeon General proclaimed last year that we have a loneliness epidemic. As I understand, throughout the West, levels of anxiety are, if not unprecedented, close to it. I mean, we are genuinely in a world of hurt, and there is so much data that is out there that, whether it's the work you do or, people in your industry and so forth, it kind of begs a question as to why there is still so much, why people aren't doing the work. And, maybe you alluded to it a minute ago, but why do you think that is? It's like it's just comfortable, like people staying in abusive relationships. There is a perverse comfort in what is normal and familiar. But I'm really curious because there is so much hurt and heartache out there and so many solutions, and yet the hurt and heartache persist.
One way to, I think there's a lot of pieces to that question, but I think one piece that comes to my mind is that it kind of lean into what we've been saying so far, because I think it keeps a bit of a through thread. It's like, to me, let's put it like this. Learning most new skills, whether it's learning a musical instrument, whether it's learning a sport, you go through a really frustrating period of incompetence, right? It's like, think about it like stages of competence. You start off with unconscious incompetence. You don't even know what you don't know. And then you move to conscious incompetence. You now see all the things that you basically don't know. And then you move to conscious competence, like you can do the thing, but it requires a lot of effort and focus, to eventually move to unconscious competence. You can do the thing without really thinking about doing the thing. And I think often what happens is people's expectations around inner work are not accurate. Like, people think they're going to close their eyes and meditate, and then they're worried they're going to fall into some state of total bliss. People say, I don't want to lift weights because I'm worried about getting too ripped in the gym. It's like, you got to lift a lot of weights to get ripped in the gym, doing weights 2 or 3 times a week is probably not going to cut it anyway. So my point is, it's like, so many of the treasures of inner work are a few steps further down the path than a lot of people get to. So people dabble, right? People do a bit of this, a bit of that. I think people these days over-index on information and they under-index on action.
Oh my God, yes. 1,000,000 times yes. Okay, keep going, but yes.
Yeah, well, it's like, back in my day, in the kind of mid to late 90s, if I wanted to get a self-help book, I had to go to the local library and I had to order it, which, by the way, is like an 18-year-old guy. It was really embarrassing to order books on self-love. But there was not a lot of information around. The problem we have now is that, we've got YouTube, we've got podcasts, we've got, ebooks. It's like, there is so much information that's there, that I think what's happening is a lot of people think they're doing a lot of inner work because they're constantly consuming that information. But that is not the same as actually doing their daily practices. Like, if you're working to change your inner landscape, and you're not doing some kind of inner practice for a consistent amount of time each day, then all you're doing is feeding your mind, which has its place. I'm not saying that it doesn't have a value to it.
Well, it's almost like a form of entertainment in a way, right? I mean, I'm not knocking anybody who is, seeking that information, but without the action and internalizing it through changing yourself, it becomes a form of, to me, it is kind of glorified entertainment.
Yeah, I had a really interesting experience actually recently. It's the first time I sort of reflect on it publicly, but I've got a whole bunch of different programs, online programs, in-person programs that I do. My flagship program, the Reset program, is like a 30-hour intensive kind of 12-week training that people do. And I realized that one of the things that, although I teach it in lots of places, one of the things that was not happening, I felt consistently enough, a lot of in my kind of communities of things that I do, was consistent meditation practice. And so I decided to create a 6-week program, which I just called Therapeutic Meditation, which is the practice that I teach. And I did the opposite of what I do with all my other programs. I gave people less content, but I just consistently made it about doing the practice. So rather than hours of training each week and this and that, it was a 1-hour training on a Monday evening. And then it was a pre-recorded meditation that you had to do every day that week. Second week, new teaching, second meditation every day. And it seems to have been, and we've still got the last week to go next week, but it seems to have been one of the most successful programs I've ever done. But it's got the least amount of information.
No, that's amazing. But that is amazing.
Doing the practice. Yeah.
Oh my God, totally. So just real quick, how do people find that?
It won't run again until next year. So the best thing I would say is just go to my website, alexhoward.com, and sign up for something on there. There's various things. Sign up for something, and you'll be on my newsletter, and you'll find out about it. But my point is, it's not, knowledge is nice, but it's the action that creates the change, right? And so, and people have different things they're drawn to, whether it is meditation, it's yoga, it's Tai Chi, it's breath work, it's Qigong. Like, I have my opinions around what I think is the most effective practice, but that in this moment, I don't think it's the most important thing. The most important thing is that someone's doing something consistently, like at least 20 to 30 minutes consistently every day. And of course, the excuses people have is I don't have time. It goes back to where this conversation started. How many hours you spend on social media? How many hours of TV? How many hours gaming? How many hours, hanging out with friends, having sort of gossipy conversation as opposed to actually doing the work? And one of the examples just quickly around meditation, which I think is a good one. We have a friend of ours who has a big job in the city in London in finance. And so he gets picked up by a driver at, I think it's 6 o'clock in the morning. So he has to get to his desk to read the international news before the markets open, to then get driven home in sort of rush hour. You go, when does he have time to meditate? Well, how he meditates twice a day, 30 minutes every day. He meditates 30 minutes in the car. Obviously, someone else is driving it. I'm not recommending you meditate while he's driving.
He's not in a Tesla driving for him.
But 30 minutes in the car. And then they have an interfaith prayer room in the office. And he goes and meditates for 30 minutes in the interfaith prayer room every lunchtime. He is meditating an hour, and he has done it for years, right? It's like there are ways around. If you travel on the train, meditate on the train if you need to. If you have in your office, if you have, maybe you don't have a prayer room, maybe you have a park bench in the park, right? But we need to do the practices, because without the practices, we're thinking about doing the work. We're not actually doing the work.
Totally. And that, to me, if anything, that's enervating, right? In the sense that you're thinking about it and you're kind of in this like state of arousal, you need to do something, and you're kind of in the space, but you're not actually doing it. I love that so much. And I'll add this. I say it any chance I get. I did a week with Joe Dispenza in this past summer in Denver. And it was, I've done a lot of work up until that point, but I'd been one of those people that just, like so many others, say, I have a hard time meditating. I grind all day. I've got 2 kids. I've got, so much going on. When I'm finally in bed and then I have to work so hard to meditate, like, yeah, no thanks, I'm done. And so I use this example because doing guided meditations was a game changer. And having spent so much time over a week and then getting home that Sunday, I guess, almost every day I've spent between 15 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes almost every day for 5 months. And it's made a gigantic difference. So I am a billion times with you. And which is also why personally I'm asking, I'm like, oh, I want to do that course with you, Alex. I'm a billion times with you that I genuinely think, and by the way, yes, there's breath work and and meditation can be in a continuum, but I don't think there's an alternative, because it comes down to, and I know we got to go in about 10, 15 minutes. Talk to us about resetting your nervous systems, because it feels like, whether it's God or Mother Nature or the universe, we have all this exquisite, if you will, machinery inside of us, and intelligence inside of us that can be healed. And yes, there's work involved, and it's an immediate instant gratification society. So if it takes a few weeks or a few months, I know a lot of people get a little itchy. But there's really something exquisite inside of us that we can all that we can all leverage, yes, through meditation, but we just talk a little bit about the mechanics of, it really comes back to your nervous system, and that so many of us are in this high state of alert and anxiety. You talk about it so beautifully. So just help everybody understand why this is so important.
Yeah, let me, I'll use a little framework, which I think will help here. When it comes to resetting the nervous system, so what I would call cultivating a healing state, both for our physical body, but also for our emotional healing, there are steps to that process, and the sequence of those steps I find is important. So the word reset is a description of what we want to do, but it's also an acronym of 5 stages, right? So the R of reset is we've got to recognize what's happening in the first place. If you can see it, you don't have to be it, right? One of the challenges is that many people are walking around their life hyper dysregulated without even recognizing it's happening. What they're aware of is the symptoms of dysregulation. So they're aware of the anxiety, or they're aware of the attachment issue in relationships, or they're aware of the addiction, which is their attempt to try to self-medicate their nervous system, right? So we're aware of the symptoms, but we're often not aware of what's underlying them, which is nervous system. Nearly always, at least an element of it is nervous system.
But hang on, let me just chime in there and interrupt you for a second. And you talk about this in your book too, that so often these symptoms, yes, some I feel like the awareness can be on a continuum. For some people, I mean, for me even, for such a long time, I felt that anxiety in my chest and the fear and so forth. I was pretty old before I was like, oh crap, that's anxiety, right? So I feel like even to get to that recognition that actually isn't normal, it's almost like you need to understand that actually isn't normal.
Yeah, well, I think the challenge is often what happens is we normalize to the state we're in, right? And in a way, that's a good thing, because if the whole time you were dysregulated, you were constantly aware of how dysregulated you were, life wouldn't be much fun. So there's a kind of numbing and shutting down to our experience. So the first thing is we've got to recognize. The second step...
And hang on, because the thing you said, I love it. If you see it, you don't have to be it. What do you mean by that?
So awareness can empower action. So if you can be aware that your system is dysregulated, you can choose to do something to change it. Yeah. So then if we come to the first E of reset, it's to examine why. What's the history? What's the context? We didn't get time to get into sort of frameworks around childhood trauma and so on, but we can start to map and understand the events, the experiences, and actually, in a way, more importantly than the what that happened, it's what we learned to do in response to what happened, right? So we need to examine and understand and figure out those different patterns.
And will you just talk just for a sec, since our time is pretty tight? I mean, the being an overachiever, a helper, talking faster. Will you just give a little list? Because I feel like, wow, it's like they're so normalized. So what are some of those things that either are super common, that's like, duh, like, but who cares? I don't mind being duh. And then some of the things that people are like, wait, what? That's a trauma response?
Yeah, sure. Achievers one, we're basically trying to compensate for our inner sense of deficiency by what we achieve on the outside. What I call a helper pattern is another one, where we're constantly trying to give to others what we're deficient in ourselves. And the kind of hope is, if I give it to them, then I'm going to get it back in some way. A perfectionist pattern is another one, that if I do everything right, then I'm going to be safe. A controller pattern is another one, that if I can control everything that's happening around me, then I'm going to feel safe on the inside. An anxiety pattern, one of the things that we can often find ourselves doing is trying to think our way to a feeling of safety, right? Like, if I analyze this enough and I run enough different outcomes and scenarios, then I'm going to feel safe. The problem is that all it does is disconnects us more, and safety is a feeling. So you can't think your way to a feeling. All you can do is think your way further away from feeling. So we have these various patterns that we develop as ways to try to compensate for our kind of childhood experiences. But going back to the frame that we used earlier, the walls that we build to keep us safe in childhood become the walls of the prison in adulthood. These are bricks in those walls. So we need to examine those. But then the third stage, so that the S of reset, is we've got to stop those patterns. We've got to be able to catch those patterns of thinking. We've got to be able to rewire those patterns of thinking. We've got to be able to train our nervous system. Another way to think about the S of reset is to self-regulate. We've got to learn how to self-regulate our nervous system. And that really goes back to what you and I were talking about a few minutes ago about the importance of those practices. And in my body of work, there are very specific practices that we teach to people to help facilitate that process. But the next step, I think, is also really important. And the sequence of the steps is also important. So the second E of reset is emotions. It's our emotional healing work. Going back to what we talked about, some of my journey and all that stuff that was held in the body. Because often what is driving our nervous system to be dysregulated, just like I was talking about with my story, is an escape pattern from feeling our feelings. So as we start to calm the nervous system, we start to feel those feelings. Now, if we don't have the support and we don't know how to do that, what happens is we go straight back into our head. And this is where you have people that have been doing, be it meditation practices, be it psychotherapeutic practices for years, and they're still stuck in their head because they haven't been supported to actually process the emotions that are held in the body. If we try to do that emotional healing, though, before we have some self-regulation of the system, then actually what happens is it's a little bit like having a distressed child going to a dysregulated parent for support. The child typically becomes more distressed. So when people go straight into doing lots of deep emotional healing work without learning how to self-regulate their system first, they're not actually healing the emotions, they're re-experiencing the traumas. And this is where people can sometimes spend years in sort of therapeutic work just suffering, because all they're doing is taking their unresourced adult self to re-experience their unresourced child self. And so we need to build those resources, we need to build that state of self-regulation to actually be able to hold our feelings and our emotions. We then come to the fifth stage, the T of reset, which is we then need to transform not just our relationship with ourselves, but our relationships with our friends, with our families. This often means putting new and healthier boundaries in place. We teach people how to treat us, and often we haven't taught people the right ways to teach us, often because we're not treating ourselves very well. And as we start to change how we treat ourselves, we need to re-educate often the people around us.
Okay, I have like a million questions for each of those, and we don't have time to get into all of them. Do you have like 5 more minutes with me?
Yeah, I got 5
Okay,
minutes, yeah.
perfect. So one of the things that I loved, and it goes back to this reset acronym, you talk about how creating an inner state of safety is a superpower. Literally your words. Just talk about that a little bit, because that to me, I was like, yes, snap, right? And it just feels like it's going back to regulating your nervous system, using meditation. But just talk about what you mean by how that inner state of safety is a superpower, and any ideas for how people can start to give that superpower to themselves.
Yeah, first you just say, it's funny when you write things because you don't realize what's going to land and what's not going to land. And it's one of the most, Amazon tells you in their ebooks what are the most like underlined statements. It's one of the most underlined statements in the book. So I was like, oh, wow, okay. What I mean by that is so much of the suffering that we experience is because we aren't able to self-regulate ourselves. So we're constantly looking for things outside of us to give us that safety. And that could be other people. And then we end up in toxic relationships, in codependent relationships. It could be substances. It could be alcohol. It could be excessive exercise, like whatever it is. But when we have a capacity to self-regulate our own nervous system, so we get overloaded, we get activated, but then we can come back to a place of safety inside of ourselves. We then can unhook that core emotional need of safety from the world around us. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't feel more comfortable around certain people or in certain situations. I'm not saying we want to become a sort of completely disconnected person that's just like an island and doesn't have any human interaction. But it's just like when we come to an intimate relationship, as a healthy, functional person, not looking for someone else to complete us or fix us, the foundation of that relationship is healthier. The same thing is true that when self-regulation is a foundation of ourselves, everything else in our life tends to function and work much better.
Yeah. And I want to underscore what you just said. When we're looking outside of ourselves for safety and comfort, we're never going to find it. And it's going to lead to, in my case, workaholism. And I think you even talked about like doing too much. I was like, oh my God, Alex, quit looking at me. Right? I mean, all these, and what's tough about things like being hyperproductive and a workaholic, like those are virtues, right? I mean, I come from a family with alcoholism and eating disorders, like a lot that was so self-destructive. So I was smart enough to not do those things. And if anything, then it was like, ooh, look at how good I am. I'm such a good girl. I work so hard. I mean, it's such a load of crap. And yet it's helped me build an incredible business. And so, I guess I just want to call that out, that some of these traits that can be really maladaptive, where we're looking outside of ourselves, can be a double-edged sword. But ultimately, whether it's media addiction or sex or food or alcohol or any of those things, toxic relationships like you described, where we're looking from the out, for something on the outside of us to give us that comfort, that to me is addiction. Like you're never going to find it, like, because you can never get enough to satisfy, right? That is to me the inside work we have to do.
Agreed. And just a quick point on that. I think it's not the helper pattern or an achiever pattern or whatever is inherently wrong. It's the way that we're in relationship with it, right? And so, I'm still very driven by nature, right? I've had chapters of my life where I've really fought against that, and that was necessary at certain points. But I love challenging myself. I love setting myself big goals and driving myself to get them. The difference is my sense of self-worth and self-esteem is relatively well unhooked from those things. So it's more of a playground than it is a war ground, right? It's not like, oh my God, like if this doesn't happen, it's going to be awful. And it's also that capacity. That the other thing that again, it's a whole other kind of rabbit hole, but something that I'm a really big fan of is developing psychological and emotional flexibility. So sometimes, we really want to go for something, but we also need to know how to switch off. We need to know how to let go, right? It's like, I work pretty hard Monday to Friday, and I don't work weekends. It's like, I hang out with my kids, I hang out with my wife, hang out with my friends, I do the things that I enjoy doing. We have a lot of family time. And that took me years to learn how to do that. But that ability to switch off, I mean, I could also argue it's made me more successful because it means I'm more resourced. But that wasn't the reason to do it. The reason to do it was,
I'm totally tracking. Mm-hmm. Well, and it almost seems like it's cause and effect, a little like, because you've done your inner work, you have the wisdom to say, I'm going to have a more balanced life, and that becomes regenerative. So when you hit it hard again Monday morning, you've been regenerated, right? Versus trying to drive fast on an empty tank, which is something that I've done for a long time, and then I wonder why I'm so miserable and crabby. It's like, yeah, that just doesn't work. Okay, last quick topic. You talk in the book and even you referenced it briefly here a moment ago about when you're transforming, you're able to transform in your own life. Talk to me about the critical importance of how when you do your inner work and you're able to transform, what that means to your relationships.
Well, I think every relationship that we have in our life is really shaped by the relationship we have with ourselves. So if we have an unhealthy relationship with ourselves, we cannot have sustained, healthy relationship with other people. And so, one can go too far on this. One can become narcissistic and become overly fixated on themselves. And, one of the best indicators of a healthy long-term relationship is also compromise, right? Like the ability to not have to get what we want all the time. And so my point is not that work on yourself should mean that you think that you are more important than your partner, but one should think you are at least equally as important as your partner. And that, going back to what we were saying, that ability to self-regulate one's nervous system has a big impact in a relationship. I have a whole body of work around the impact of nervous system dysregulation on attachment styles. And when our nervous system is dysregulated, typically what happens is we then don't form healthy attachment, whether we become anxiously attached or avoidantly attached. The more that we can have that self-regulation inside of ourselves, the more that we can actually show up in a healthy, sustainable, functional way to intimate relationship with another, and also healthy friendship with other people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's been my experience entirely. I mean, I've always been somebody who's been warm and caring and prioritized the people around me. And I'm super type A. So it's like, I'm going to will it into being. But it is amazing to me how, as I've done my inner work and, just to really be clear about nervous system stuff, we've got the parasympathetic nervous system, which is, the rest and digest and where you're calm and able to connect and feeling peace and gratitude, versus your sympathetic nervous system, which is a fight or flight. And, just because I feel like talking about nervous system stuff people can be like, I don't know what they're talking about. I'm tuned out. And so I realized I was in fight or flight, and that was normal to me. And as I've done my meditations, as I've done my journaling and all these things that I've personally done, like you, Alex, like so committed, so sincerely. And at times I'm like, what the frick? I'm spending so much time, like I want to live my life. And yet I'm so glad I've done that work, because now my life is genuinely blissful. But it took some time, like, not gonna lie. And yet, there's moments of joy, and it's like, breakthrough. So there are little bits of joy along the way. It's not just, it's sort of like the journey is, it's like the end is in the journey itself. But I say all that because my relationships with my husband, with my kids, with my team, with so many people around me, I'm showing up differently. And it is like, holy smokes. And so I say all that just for folks listening to go, ooh, if I'm not feeling that degree of connectedness and joyfulness with the people around me and within myself, it's available to you. And Alex Howard and his team and his books and work can be a resource to you, my wonderful listening community. Last question for real. I could keep you on here for days. I hope to bring you back soon, Alex. If you were Moses on the mountain or Muhammad or, any name you want to give, and you had one tablet that just said, hey, this is the message that I want to give to planet Earth, what would that one message be?
I think if we keep it let's keep it in the spirit of this conversation, I would say, do the work, you're worth it.
Do the work, you're worth it. Amen. That is an amazing place to end on. Thank you, Alex. It has been such a pleasure to get to talk with you, especially after feeling like I I know you. It's like, it's cool to, once you, especially when you read a book or listen to a story that's as personal as yours, it's really cool to be able to talk with you as we have. And I really thank you for the incredible work you've done on yourself so that you're able to help people like me and so many others, because you were willing to do the work and you realized you were worth it. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for having me. I appreciate it. It's been a lovely conversation. Thanks for your time.
Oh my gosh. How amazing is Alex Howard? And I would love to summarize the whole thing for you and for me. But I really want to underscore before we wrap up here, a couple of his really wise statements, starting with, it's not your fault, but it's your responsibility. That one hits home for me. The other one that we obviously talked a lot about toward the end is, if we're looking outside ourselves for safety or comfort or validation, we're looking in the wrong place. And I don't even want to say guilty, because it's an adaptive coping mechanism, but I did that for such a long time. And so I hope that if you, like me, whether it's any form of addiction, people pleasing, doing too much, any of those things that are maladaptive, being the chronic peacekeeper, any of those patterns that, like he described, none of them are inherently bad, but they come with a certain motivation and sort of an attachment to an outcome. And where we get our love and where we get our sense of self-worth, rather than it coming from the inside, we're trying to get it from the outside in. So I love those. I love those insights. I love Alex's story. It's so compelling. And if you are listening and like Alex said, if you're not yet sincerely committed to doing the work, but you're struggling and you're spending a lot of time consuming the information, I just really beseech you, whether it's a meditation practice or some other mindfulness or breath work, please do the work. That's why I'm here. And I'm so passionate because, like I've said, I'm still very much on my healing journey, but man, it is like night and day for me personally, which is why I bring you the show, why I bring you these amazing guests and resources so that you too can transform and genuinely feel joy and even bliss in your life. Okay, that's it for Getting Open. Thanks so much for tuning in. I would love your feedback. Are there guests you want to see on the show? What do you love? What would you like more or less of? Please email me at gettingopen@yourtango.com. And I would love for you to also share your comments wherever you're getting this video podcast, whether it's on YouTube, iHeart, Spotify. Please follow, please share. I'm bringing you, along with my amazing team, bringing you this show with my full heart. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.